You need to watch this if you crave chills down your spine. Welcome to Soul Studios. Here, true crime meets the unknown. Suspense lurks in every shadow, and supernatural forces whisper from the dark. We craft chilling, edge-of-your-seat short stories inspired by the eerie, the unexplained, and the most haunting mysteries. 3 new stories drop every week, each one darker than the last. Are you ready to step inside? Subscribe now before the next story finds you.
After the sudden death of his beloved wife Claire, grieving artist Michael Rowe retreats to a secluded lakeside cabin to escape the world and himself. But in the quiet hours before dawn, he begins waking beside a woman who insists she is Claire. Same voice, same touch, same haunting scent. As love and longing blur into obsession and terror, Michael is pulled into a chilling spiral of memory, guilt and hallucination, or something far more sinister. The truth of what really happened the night Claire died begins to unravel, revealing that the past isn't buried, and some love stories refuse to stay dead. The Sweetest Thing is a psychological horror that explores the terrifying depths of grief, the fragility of memory, and the darkest corners of devotion. If you love stories that linger long after the final word, twisting your mind and chilling your soul, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. At Soul Studios, we don't just tell stories, we summon them. Stay close, the next one's already watching. Michael Rowe stood at the edge of the lake, the cold autumn wind biting gently at his cheeks. The lake's surface lay still and dark, a pane of black glass stretching into the dusk. Pines and skeletal birch trees crowded the shoreline, their reflections wavering with each ripple that disturbed the mirror of water. The smell of damp leaves and rich earth filled his lungs as he breathed in deeply, trying to steady himself. It had been 3 days since Michael arrived at the remote lakeside cabin, seeking refuge from a world that no longer made sense without her. Claire. Her name echoed in his mind like a prayer and a curse. He closed his eyes and could almost feel her presence behind him, imagining her slender arms wrapping around his waist, her chin resting on his shoulder as she used to do. The memory was so vivid that he held his breath, half hoping to hear her soft voice say, "Isn't it beautiful, Michael?" The way she had the last time they stood by this very lake together. But there was only silence, broken by the distant cry of a loon across the water. A shiver ran through him, and not just from the chill. Michael opened his eyes and slowly released the breath he'd been holding. The lake remained just a lake, the woods just woods, no loving wife magically standing there to greet him. Of course not. Claire was gone, 6 months now, and nothing in the world could bring her back. Not even the desperate wish that had lodged itself in his heart like a thorn since the day she died. He turned away from the water and trudged back toward the cabin. The dry leaves and pine needles crunched under his boots, a lonely accompaniment to his thoughts. The cabin was a modest A-frame structure of weathered logs and green-painted shutters, tucked between towering pines that swayed and whispered in the wind. It belonged to an old friend who had offered it as a retreat, a place for Michael to heal, or whatever it was people expected him to do after such a loss. He wasn't sure healing was possible. He wasn't sure he deserved it. The wooden steps groaned as he ascended to the porch. Faded wind chimes hung from the eaves, tinkling a hollow greeting as he opened the front door. Inside, the cabin air was cool and tinged with the scent of old wood smoke and something sweet, perhaps the remnants of the cinnamon candles Claire had lit during their last visit here over a year ago. Michael paused in the doorway, a lump forming in his throat as memory flooded in. He could almost see her, curled on the threadbare couch with a novel in hand, her dark curls catching the golden light of the late afternoon sun that filtered through the window. She'd glance up and smile that gentle, dimpled smile, asking if he'd join her or if inspiration had struck him to go paint the sunset. Michael pressed a hand to his eyes, willing the image away before it shattered him completely. The silence in the cabin pressed on his ears, heavy and absolute, as if the space itself mourned her absence. He stepped inside and shut the door behind him, turning the deadbolt with a decisive click. Alone. He was truly alone out here, by his own choice. No neighbours for miles, no sounds of traffic or hum of city life, just the whisper of wind and water and the creaking of the old pine bones of the cabin. It was what he thought he wanted. Solitude to process his grief, to escape the pitying looks of friends and colleagues who didn't know what to say to the widower at 42, the once brilliant artist now hollowed out by tragedy. He set about building a fire, more for the comfort of its light than the warmth. His fingers trembled as he stacked the split logs in the stone fireplace and stuffed wadded newspaper beneath them. Striking a match, he watched as the flame caught and danced along the kindling. Shadows leapt to life in the corners of the room. The fire crackled and began to pop, a familiar homely sound that eased some of the tightness in his chest. Michael sank into the old armchair facing the hearth. The cushions exhaled dust and the scent of cedar as he leaned back. Above the mantel hung a framed photograph of him and Claire from 2 summers ago. In it, they stood right outside this cabin, arms wrapped around each other, sunburnt and smiling, utterly unaware of what fate had in store. Michael forced himself to look at her face in the photo, her wide hazel eyes, the freckles across her nose that she hated but he adored, her smile radiant even in the still image. The sweetest thing in his life, he'd often told her. Now that face was just a memory and a photograph. The real Claire was buried in the cold ground back home, lost to him forever on a rain-slick highway one terrible night. They had said it was an accident. Everyone said so, the police, the doctors, even well-meaning friends. It was no one's fault, Michael. A patch of black ice, it could have happened to anyone. At the funeral, he remembered nodding numbly as people murmured those words, their hands patting his shoulder, their faces a blur. But deep down, Michael never fully believed it. If only he had driven more slowly. If only they hadn't left the house that evening. If only. The guilt gnawed at him in every quiet moment. It was the relentless whisper in his mind, second-guessing every choice leading up to the crash. Why was he spared while she was taken? In the months since, sleep had become a stranger. When it did come, it brought nightmares, fractured images of twisting metal, shattering glass, Claire's scream cut short. Michael would wake up drenched in sweat, the phantom echo of that scream in his ears. He tried therapy for a while, and pills too. Little white tablets that dulled the edges of his sorrow, but also dimmed everything else. He had abandoned them shortly before coming out here, preferring pain to emptiness. At least the pain meant he still felt something, that he was still alive while she was not. Outside, the day was bleeding into night, the early darkness of late autumn creeping in. Michael glanced at his phone on the side table. The battery had died sometime yesterday, and he hadn't bothered to charge it. Reception was spotty out here anyway, and he had no desire to talk to anyone. Not yet. The well-meaning voicemails and text messages had slowed in recent weeks, but he knew if he reconnected, they'd flood in again. People checking on him, tiptoeing around the tragedy, offering help or awkward encouragement. He appreciated their concern, he truly did, but none of them could give him what he wanted. They couldn't bring Claire back. On a whim, Michael found himself rising from the armchair and moving to the far corner of the main room, where he had stowed his art supplies. A blank canvas sat on an easel by the window, illuminated by the orange glow of the fire. Tubes of oil paint and brushes lay neatly arranged on a small table, untouched since he arrived. He hadn't painted anything in months. The urge and inspiration that once came as naturally as breathing had fled after Claire's death. Still, something about the stillness of the lake at dusk and the whispering pines stirred a faint itch in him now. Perhaps he could sketch the shoreline, he thought, or the way the last light lingered on the water. He picked up a piece of charcoal and held it hesitantly above the canvas. His hand shook. The white surface stared back, as blank and cold as the new life ahead of him. Michael exhaled slowly to steady himself and lowered the charcoal to make the first stroke, a horizontal line, the horizon of the lake. He added the suggestion of trees, a rough outline of the distant shore. His movements were stiff, uncertain at first, but as minutes passed, he found himself absorbed in the process. The cabin fell away, the ache in his chest dulled. It was just him and the canvas and the growing sketch beneath his hand. As he sketched, he caught himself humming softly, an absent tune that he didn't immediately recognize. When he paused and listened, he realized it was a melody Claire used to hum while doing chores or cooking, a fragment of an old love song she loved. The realization made his chest tighten and his hand faltered, smudging a line. He set the charcoal down, flexing his cramped fingers, and stepped back to examine what he'd drawn. The sketch was simple but evocative, dark trees framing the glimmer of the moon on the water. But there, at the center of the composition where the shore met the lake, was something he hadn't intended to draw. A faint outline of a figure. It was just a few vague strokes, but it looked like someone standing at the water's edge. A woman, if his eyes didn't deceive him, facing the lake with her back to the viewer. Michael's skin prickled. Had he drawn that without realizing? He didn't recall adding it. Yet there it was, a ghostly smudge of charcoal that gave the tranquil scene an eerie focal point. A thump sounded from the loft above the main room, breaking Michael's focus. He startled, heart lurching into his throat. It sounded like something had dropped onto the floor upstairs. The cabin was old. It creaked and settled, especially as the night air cooled. Probably just the beams shifting or a squirrel on the roof, he told himself. But in the wake of the uneasy feeling the sketch gave him, the sudden noise set his pulse racing. Climbing the narrow ladder-like stairs to the loft, Michael called out, "Hello?" His voice sounded small in the vast quiet. There was no answer, but the slight echo of his own word. The loft held the bedroom area, a queen-sized bed with a patchwork quilt, a dresser, and a window overlooking the lake. Moonlight silvered the floorboards. Nothing seemed out of place. He checked the skylight. Perhaps a pine cone or branch had fallen on it, but the glass was clear, showing only the first faint stars in the indigo sky. With a sigh, he sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress sank under his weight. This was the bed he and Claire had shared on their getaway trips, where they'd whispered late into the night about dreams and silly worries, where they'd made love under the patter of rain on the roof. Now the sheets were cold, and the silence in the loft felt heavier than downstairs. Michael rubbed his hands over his face, exhaustion suddenly washing over him. The emotional turmoil of the day, of every day since she died, finally demanded its due. He didn't bother changing out of his clothes. He simply lay back on top of the quilt, staring up at the dark rafters. In the stillness, his own heartbeat sounded loud in his ears. He thought about the figure in his sketch and how his mind kept playing tricks on him. He had heard her voice in his dreams more than once since the accident, felt her in the flutter of curtains or the warmth of a fading sunset. It's just grief, he told himself again. Only grief. Eventually, his eyelids grew heavy, the dance of firelight from downstairs casting flickering shadows through the loft. Michael drifted into a fitful sleep with Claire's name on his lips. At some murky hour past midnight, Michael stirred. The fire had dwindled to embers, and the cabin was draped in darkness. He wasn't fully awake, hovering in the twilight between dream and consciousness. In that haze, he felt the mattress shift, as though someone had sat down or lain beside him. A warmth pressed against his back, the unmistakable sensation of another body in the bed. His breath caught. He could smell something faint and familiar, vanilla and jasmine. Claire's scent. It flooded him with comfort and terror all at once. Half asleep, Michael dared not move, barely breathed. He felt a gentle touch brush through his hair, a caress only Claire would give. In his dreamlike state, he almost melted into it, a desperate part of him wanting so badly to sink back into that feeling of her beside him. A sleepy smile tugged at his lips. "Claire," he thought he whispered. He swore he heard a quiet hum in return, a familiar tune, the very same lullaby of a love song he'd found himself humming earlier. Suddenly Michael jerked fully awake. His eyes flew open to total darkness and his own ragged breathing. He fumbled for the lamp on the bedside table and clicked it on. Pale yellow light chased the shadows into the corners. The other half of the bed was empty, the quilt undisturbed save for the rumpled impression from his own body. There was no one there. Of course there wasn't. Michael ran a trembling hand over the sheet, cold, yet the scent of vanilla and jasmine lingered, impossible and heartbreaking. Claire's favourite perfume. He sat there for a long time, the lamplight revealing only dust motes and solitude, trying to convince himself it was a dream, a cruel trick of the mind. Eventually, when no further sound disturbed the silence and the perfume faded into memory, Michael shut off the lamp and lay back down. Sleep would not return easily. His mind whirled with longing and fear, so he lay in the dark, listening to the wind scratch the branches against the cabin walls. At some point, he realized he was crying. He pressed his face into the pillow to muffle the sobs, its fabric carrying the faint trace of vanilla that made his heart twist painfully. Alone in the woods, Michael Rowe wept until exhaustion overtook him once more. Morning light spilled through the loft window, waking Michael from a shallow, troubled sleep. He sat up slowly, muscles aching from how tensely he had slept, if he'd truly slept at all. The events of the night clung to him like cobwebs. He rubbed his eyes, trying to banish the remnants of that impossible feeling, the weight on the bed, the ghostly touch in his hair, the scent of Claire's perfume. In the clarity of daylight, it seemed absurd. A dream, he insisted to himself. It had to be a dream. Michael swung his legs over the side of the bed and froze. There, on the pillow beside his, was a single dark hair, long, wavy, unmistakably Claire's. His heart stumbled over a beat. Claire had always shed strands of her hair. He'd find them on pillows on the back of the couch, clinging to his sweaters, a small, endearing annoyance that he'd give anything to experience again. But he had washed these sheets when he arrived. Any trace of her from past visits should have been long gone. He picked up the hair with shaking fingers. It was real, tangible, twirling around his index finger like a tiny black thread. Michael's mind raced. Could it have been stuck in the bedding all this time, only now working loose? That was possible, he reasoned. It had to be possible. Yet a chill crept up his spine as he let the strand fall, watching it drift onto the white sheet like a stroke of ink. Downstairs, he busied himself with mundane tasks to shake off the lingering unease. He boiled water on the gas stove for coffee and stepped out onto the porch while it brewed. The morning was crisp, the sun just cresting the tree line across the lake. Dew glistened on the fallen leaves. Michael inhaled the pine-tinged air deeply. Get a grip, he thought. You're overtired. Grief is playing tricks. A hair on a pillow was not proof of anything but his own desperation to feel her presence. And last night's sensations, likely a half-waking hallucination. He'd read about this, how the bereaved sometimes conjured their loved ones in their sleep. It was painful, but it was normal, wasn't it? After breakfast, Michael decided some exercise might help dispel his restless energy. He fetched the axe from the small shed and set about splitting some firewood rounds piled near the cabin. The physical exertion was a welcome distraction. Each swing of the axe bit deep into the wood with a satisfying thunk. As he worked, plumes of breath puffed from his lips in the chill air. He tried to let his mind go blank, focusing only on the rhythm. Lift, swing, split. When he paused to wipe sweat from his brow, he happened to glance up at the cabin. His heart lurched. For just an instant, he thought he saw a figure standing at the loft window. A woman, her face obscured by reflection, but the silhouette so familiar it made his throat constrict. Claire. It had looked like Claire. The axe slipped from his fingers, thudding to the ground. Michael blinked and shielded his eyes against the sky's glare, squinting at the window. The figure was gone. The curtains within stirred gently, as if someone had just been there and moved away. "Claire," he found himself calling out, voice cracking. Only the rustle of pines answered. Michael jogged up the porch steps and into the cabin, leaving the axe buried in a stump. Inside, the air was still, the only sound his own harsh breathing as he dashed up to the loft. The bed was just as he left it. The hair he'd found still lay on the pillow. No sign of anyone. He raced back down, checked the small bathroom, even opened the closet and peered under the bed like a madman hunting a phantom. Nothing. Nobody. He leaned against the wall, hands on his knees, trying to slow the pounding of his heart. If Claire's ghost was haunting him, why would she hide? And if he was truly losing his mind, when would it stop? The stress and isolation were clearly getting to him. Perhaps coming out here alone hadn't been the best idea after all. But what was the alternative? Staying in the city under the watchful pity of friends. He raked a hand through his hair. Pull it together. By late afternoon, grey clouds had begun to gather over the lake, promising a drizzly evening. Michael forced himself to do a few more sketches and ate a can of soup for lunch, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But his eyes kept straying to empty doorways and to the loft above, anticipating movement that never came. Every so often he would catch the faintest whiff of vanilla, but he couldn't tell if it was real or just lodged in his nostrils from before. As dusk approached, he conceded that he was too on edge to trust his own senses. Perhaps a drink would calm him. There was an old bottle of single malt scotch he'd brought for cold nights. This certainly qualified. Michael poured himself a glass and lit a few candles as the storm clouds snuffed out the remaining daylight. Rain began to patter on the roof. He sank into the armchair by the fire once more, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. The scotch burned his throat on the way down, a welcome spark of heat. "To sanity," he muttered, raising the glass in a dark toast to the empty room, or whatever's left of it. His laugh was thin and humourless. The liquor did loosen the knots of anxiety somewhat. His eyelids grew heavy as he watched the firelight flicker. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming steadily. In that cocoon of warmth and soft light, Michael felt his guard lowering. His thoughts wandered to Claire inevitably. To the first time he brought her to this cabin. They had only been dating a few months then. She had marvelled at the clarity of the stars over the lake and teased him for forgetting to bring marshmallows for the campfire. He could still see her face aglow in firelight, hear her laughter mixed with the chirr of crickets. "I miss you, Claire," he whispered to the quiet. His voice cracked on her name. Saying it aloud made the ache all the more real. He closed his eyes, letting the memories wash over him along with waves of drowsiness. "I'd give anything to have you back." The glass slipped a little in his loosening grasp. Michael didn't notice the exact moment he drifted from reverie into sleep. The line between the two had been blurred for days. A clap of thunder jarred him awake. Michael blinked, disoriented. The fire had burned low, and the candles had guttered out, leaving the cabin in a dim haze lit occasionally by flashes of lightning at the windows. He noticed two things immediately. A woven blanket was draped over him. He didn't remember grabbing it. And the air was rich with the aroma of vanilla and jasmine once more. Stronger now, as if, behind him, a floorboard creaked. Michael's breath caught. Slowly, he turned his head toward the sound. In the faint glow of the dying fire stood a figure, illuminated just enough for him to recognize the slender form, the cascade of dark curls, the pale oval of a face he knew better than his own. Claire stood only a few paces away, watching him. His heart thundered louder than the storm outside. He sat up straight, letting the blanket tumble to the floor. He had to be dreaming. Had to be. "But I feel awake." His mind spun. "Claire?" he rasped, barely louder than a breath. She smiled softly, that same gentle smile from the photograph on the mantel. "Hey, sleepyhead," she said, her voice light, warm, real. "You dozed off. I was just about to tease you for becoming an old man on me." Michael's vision blurred. He realized tears had sprung to his eyes. He squeezed them shut and opened again, convinced she'd vanish like all the other dreams. But she remained, solid and clear. Claire looked exactly as she had in life, jeans and the oversized flannel shirt she often wore around the house, her cheeks slightly flushed from the warmth of the fire. Every detail was perfect, down to the tiny gold heart pendant around her neck, the one he'd given her on their first anniversary. This can't be," he stammered, slowly getting to his feet. His legs felt unsteady, as if they belonged to someone else. "Claire, He wanted to reach for her, but terror held him back. A terror that she would disappear if he touched her, or worse, that she wouldn't, and that this was somehow real. "You're dead." We had your funeral." At the word dead, Claire's expression flickered. Her smile dimmed, a crease of concern appearing on her brow. "Michael, what are you talking about?" she asked gently, stepping closer. Her boots made a soft thud on the wood floor. "I'm right here. I'm fine." He stumbled back a step, almost tripping over the fallen blanket. His pulse roared in his ears. "No, I saw you. In the car, you." He couldn't bring himself to say died again. His brain felt split in two, one side screaming that this was impossible, the other side flooding him with joy at seeing her, holding on to the moment with desperate fervour. Tears spilled freely down his cheeks now. Claire closed the distance between them in an instant, her hands coming up to cup his face. Her palms were warm, thumb brushing away one of his tears, exactly the way she used to. Michael inhaled sharply. She smelled like Claire, felt like Claire. He stared into her eyes. They were deep brown, steadied with tenderness and a hint of amusement as they gazed back at him. "You're okay, Michael," she said softly. "I'm okay. It was just a bad dream, sweetheart. I'm here now." He let out a choked sound, somewhere between a laugh and a sob. His hands rose uncertainly to rest over hers, feeling solid skin, delicate bones. This can't be a hallucination, some part of him thought wildly. It was too real. The texture of her skin, the gentle pressure of her hands, the subtle scar on her left knuckle from a kitchen accident years ago. All of it. Michael was afraid to blink. "If this is a dream," he whispered, voice trembling, "I don't ever want to wake up." Claire's eyes softened, and she pulled him into an embrace. Michael felt her arms wrap around him, her head fit into the crook of his neck. She was shorter than him by a head, just as she had always been. He could feel her heart beating against his chest, a calm, steady rhythm. A sob of relief burst from him, and he clutched her tightly, fear and sorrow and longing all crashing through him. "Claire! Oh God, Claire!" he cried into her hair, which was as soft as silk against his face. They stood like that for what felt like eternity, Michael afraid that if he let go she would dissolve into smoke. The storm raged outside, wind lashing rain against the windows, but inside his world had narrowed to the woman in his arms. Finally he pulled back just enough to look at her again, his hands on her shoulders. He was almost afraid to ask, but he had to. "How?" he managed, voice rough. "How are you here?" He hesitated, then in a shaky whisper added, Am I crazy?" Claire let out a gentle laugh, the sound like music he never thought he'd hear again. "You're not crazy, and I'm here because I never left, silly." She brushed back a strand of hair from his eyes, a familiar affectionate gesture. "Maybe you were the one who left me for a while. You've been so distant, locked in your own head, but I'm here, Michael. I've always been here." He struggled to make sense of her words. It was like she was speaking in riddles. I don't understand," he said. "I saw you in the hospital. You weren't breathing. They said you were gone." His voice broke again. A flash of something hurt, anger, flickered in Claire's eyes, but it was gone as soon as it came. She guided him back toward the armchair and gently urged him to sit. "Shh, it's all right," she cooed, kneeling beside him. Her hands never left his, as if grounding him. "You've been through so much pain, my love. Maybe your mind made mistakes, filled in blanks. What matters is I'm here now, flesh and blood." She squeezed his hand pointedly. "You can feel that, can't you?" He nodded numbly. The rational part of his brain was rapidly being overrun by the sheer miracle of this moment. There would be time for questions later, he thought. Maybe there was some explanation. Maybe she had survived and he had misheard the doctors, or maybe he had a breakdown and only imagined the funeral. The notion that his memory could betray him that completely was terrifying, but here she was. Could grief truly conjure something so real? No, he decided. He couldn't deny the evidence of his senses. Claire was here, alive. Michael cupped her face in his hands, feeling warmth bloom beneath his fingertips. A half-hysterical laugh escaped him. "I don't know what's real anymore," he admitted, voice shaking, "but I don't care. If this is real, if you're real." Claire rose and gently tugged at his hands. "Come with me," she whispered. "You need rest. We both do." She led him toward the stairs to the loft, their fingers entwined. Michael followed, light-headed and obedient, afraid that any resistance might shatter this fragile reality. Each step felt like moving through a dream. The storm outside had settled into a steady rain, a lullaby of drips and drops on the roof. In the loft bedroom, Claire guided him to lie down. He noticed absently that the sheets had been straightened, the bed neatly made as if expecting them. He certainly hadn't done that. Michael lay back and Claire slid in beside him, her body curling against his as naturally as if every night since the accident had been like this. His mind still buzzed with unanswered questions, but her warmth against him and the rhythm of her breathing soothed him more effectively than the scotch had. She draped an arm over his chest, and he covered it with his own, threading their fingers together. "I must be dreaming," he murmured into the darkness, emotion thick in his voice. Claire pressed a soft kiss to his shoulder. "Then sleep, love," she whispered. "I'm here when you wake." With her nestled against him, Michael felt the tension drain from his body. Exhaustion and overwhelming relief converged, pulling him into a deep sleep. His last waking thought was a prayer that this was not a cruel delusion, that she would indeed be there when morning came. Michael woke to pale daylight filtering through the skylight. For a moment he lay still, afraid to move or open his eyes fully, terrified the previous night had been a vivid dream that would scatter with the morning sun. But then he became aware of gentle breathing beside him and a weight across his midsection. An arm, warm and real. His heart surged. He turned his head on the pillow. Claire was there, truly there, asleep on her side, facing him. One hand rested on his stomach, and her dark lashes fanned against her cheeks. In sleep, she looked peacefully unchanged, as though the last 6 months had never happened. Michael felt a fragile happiness bloom inside him, tempered by disbelief. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. She stirred at the sound, eyelids fluttering open. For an instant, he feared she'd look at him with cold, dead eyes or some stranger's face, his mind conjuring some horror. But no, her familiar eyes met his, and they crinkled at the corners as she smiled drowsily. "Morning," she whispered. "Morning," he echoed, voice hushed with wonder. He reached to brush a strand of hair from her face, marvelling at how the silky curl wrapped around his finger. "You're still here," he said, immediately wincing at how incredulous he sounded. It felt stupid to voice it, but he had to. She gave a little chuckle. "Where else would I be?" There was playful reproach in her tone, as if chiding him for asking something so silly. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his. "You look like you've seen a ghost." A strained laugh escaped him at her choice of words. I'm sorry. I still feel like I'm dreaming," he confessed, emotion thickening his voice. He caressed her cheek, his thumb grazing the softness of her skin. "If I am, I don't want to wake up." Claire closed her eyes at his touch, seeming to savor it. "You're not dreaming, Michael." She pulled back slightly to look at him seriously. "I'm here. We're together. That's all that matters. Let's not question it too much, okay? Not right now." Her fingers found his and squeezed, almost pleading. He nodded, swallowing hard. Maybe she was right. If this was some divine gift or cosmic anomaly, analyzing it to death might ruin it. He had been given what he yearned for most, time with her. He wasn't about to waste it with doubt and fear. "Okay," he agreed quietly. "Okay, I won't." They dressed and moved downstairs together, as if resuming a life interrupted. Michael's hands trembled only slightly now as he brewed fresh coffee and scrambled a couple of eggs in a cast-iron pan. He kept stealing glances at Claire, afraid she might vanish if he looked away too long. She moved about the cabin with ease, humming that same old love song under her breath as she straightened up clutter, tidying as if she had always been there. It struck him as both perfectly normal and utterly surreal. They sat at the small kitchen table by the window, plates of breakfast between them, steaming mugs of coffee in their hands. The rain had stopped, leaving the morning sky washed clean and pale. Raindrops clung to the glass, catching the light. Michael couldn't stop staring at her over his mug. Claire raised an eyebrow after a while, a smile playing on her lips. "Do I have something on my face?" she teased. He flushed and gave a bashful grin. "No, I can't believe how lucky I am to be sitting here with you." His voice dropped to almost a whisper at the end. Claire's expression softened. She reached across the table and took his hand. Her touch was warm, her grip reassuring. "I'm not going anywhere, Michael," she said. "Not ever again." There was a fervent undertone to her words that made Michael squeeze her hand in return. He noticed a slight tremor in her fingers, or perhaps it was his own hand shaking. For a while, they talked of ordinary things. It felt almost like any morning they'd shared before. They discussed how beautiful the lake looked after the rain, the plan to maybe hike the trail nearby later in the day, or start that jigsaw puzzle they'd brought last time but never finished. Michael found himself laughing at one of Claire's jokes, a genuine sound that felt strange in his mouth after so long. Each moment that passed with her there, acting so alive and normal, built his confidence that this was real, that he wasn't crazy. Only once did a hint of strangeness intrude on their domestic scene. Michael realized halfway through breakfast that Claire had hardly touched her food. She played with the eggs, pushing them around the plate more than eating. But before he could worry over it, she caught him looking and quipped, "I guess my eyes were hungrier than my stomach." She gave an apologetic shrug and sipped her coffee. Michael let it go, deciding that his nerves were making him read into everything. Who could blame either of them for having a light appetite, given the emotional shock? Later that morning, they ventured outside, hand in hand. The world felt renewed by the night's rain. Wet leaves glistened underfoot and droplets fell from the branches whenever a breeze passed. They walked a little path that circled around to a small wooden dock where a canoe was moored. This had been one of Claire's favourite spots. She walked ahead lightly, her fingers intertwined with Michael's, practically pulling him along in her eagerness. Seeing her like this, so vibrant, her cheeks glowing in the cool air, made Michael's chest ache with gratitude and love. On the dock, Claire spread her arms wide and inhaled. "I love that smell after the rain," she sighed happily. "Everything feels alive." She turned to Michael and grinned. "Race you to the end of the dock." Without waiting for a full answer, she tugged free and dashed the remaining steps, boots clunking on the damp wood. Michael laughed, startled by the sudden playfulness, and jogged after her. Claire was faster, as usual, and had already come to a stop at the dock's edge, where gentle waves lapped. She was peering down into the water. As Michael approached, he noticed her smile had faded. Her reflection wavered on the lake's surface beside his own, and for a moment an irrational dread gripped him. He imagined not seeing her reflection at all. But she was there, mirrored in the water, albeit distorted by ripples. "What's wrong?" he asked softly, coming to stand beside her. Claire's gaze remained on the water. "This place," she murmured. "It holds so many memories, doesn't it?" There was a wistfulness in her tone now. She reached for his hand again, and he gave it willingly. "Do you remember the last time we were here? We sat on this dock and talked about the future, about starting a family." She smiled faintly, but her eyes glistened with moisture. Michael remembered. They had spent a warm evening watching the sunset, and Claire shyly mentioned she'd stopped taking her birth control, that maybe they could try for a baby. He had been overjoyed, lifting her in his arms and spinning her around in excitement until they nearly fell into the water laughing. That was a year ago. His throat tightened at the realization that those hopes had died with her, or so he thought. "I remember," he said quietly. A heavy guilt weighted his next words. After the accident, I thought I'd lost not just you, but all of that. Everything we wanted." His voice trembled. "I'm so sorry, Claire. I'm sorry I couldn't." He choked off, the old self-blame rising. She turned and placed a finger to his lips gently, silencing him. "Shh, it wasn't your fault, Michael," she said, her tone firm but kind. "Don't carry that guilt. Not here, not now." Her absolution was like a balm and a blow at once. He wanted to believe it, to let her words wash away the blame he harboured. And for a moment, as she wrapped her arms around his waist and rested her head against his shoulder, he did feel lighter. Michael closed his eyes and held her, the two of them standing at the edge of the lake with the soft sound of water and wind around them. As he held her, a distant rumble of thunder echoed, or perhaps it was just memory playing tricks, because suddenly Michael's mind was assaulted by a vivid flash, the screech of tires on wet asphalt, a blinding rush of trees too close, Claire's voice crying out his name in terror. He flinched, sucking in a sharp breath. The embrace on the dock wavered, reality flickering. Claire pulled back to search his face, concerned. "Are you all right?" she asked. Her voice sounded distant for a heartbeat, echoing strangely in his ears. Michael forced a smile, though his heart was racing. Yeah, I'm okay. Just got dizzy for a second." He pressed a hand to his temple. The phantom memory faded, leaving him unsteady. Claire's hand moved to his back, rubbing soothing circles. "Let's go inside," she said gently. "You should rest a bit." They returned to the cabin. The rest of the day passed in a gentle quietness. Michael dozed off for a short nap on the couch while Claire sat curled up at the other end, thumbing through an old novel she found on the shelf. Her presence was a soothing balm. Even the anxious thoughts that normally plagued him grew muted in her company. By evening, the clouds had cleared, revealing a bright sprinkle of stars. They ate a light dinner of canned stew and crackers by candlelight, then retired early to the loft, both tired from the emotional roller coaster. Sometime deep in the night, Michael woke to an empty bed. The space beside him where Claire had been was cool. He blinked, disoriented, a spike of alarm piercing his chest. Had it all been a dream after all? He sat up, heart thudding, until he spotted her figure in the gloom below. Claire stood by the living room window downstairs, illuminated faintly by moonlight. She was perfectly still, her back to him. Michael let out the breath he'd been holding. She was really there. He was about to call out to her, but something made him pause. There was something unsettling about the way she stood, so motionless, arms at her sides, head slightly tilted as she gazed out into the dark. He rose quietly and descended the steps, the wood creaking under his weight. "Claire?" he said softly as he reached the bottom. She didn't turn. For a second he wondered if she was sleepwalking. He gently approached and laid a hand on her shoulder. Her body was rigid with tension. Only when his touch landed did she seem to jolt back to awareness. She drew in a sharp breath and looked at him with wide eyes. In the dim light her face appeared drawn, almost gaunt, but the next moment she smiled faintly. "Sorry," she whispered. "Did I wake you?" "No, I just noticed you were gone," he replied, searching her eyes. They seemed distant, her expression strangely blank before she masked it. "Are you okay?" Claire turned back to the window, as if unable to meet his gaze. Outside the night was calm, the lake a dark expanse merging with the starry sky. "Sometimes I have trouble sleeping," she said quietly. "I keep thinking I hear something out in the woods. It's probably nothing." She gave a small shrug. "This place can play tricks with your mind, you know. All the quiet and the darkness." Michael glanced past her shoulder into the moonlit yard. The tree line looked peaceful, just shadows on shadows. He heard nothing but the chirp of crickets and an owl in the distance. "I understand," he said softly. "Everything's so still out here, it can get eerie. But nothing's going to hurt us, Claire." She nodded, but her gaze remained fixed outside. He noticed her hand was resting on the glass, as if she had been about to push the window open. Michael gently covered her hand with his own. Her fingers were cold. "Come back to bed," he urged. "It's late." For a moment he thought she might refuse. Her posture was taut, unwilling to move. Then she sighed and turned to him, her features softening once more into the woman he knew. "You're right," she said. "Let's try to sleep." She let him lead her back upstairs, though she cast one last glance over her shoulder toward the window and the darkness beyond. Lying back in bed with her head on his chest, Michael stroked her hair and felt her gradually relax again. Yet long after she fell silent and still, he remained awake, staring into the shadows. The image of her standing at the window, so lost in thought, so strangely grim, kept pricking at him. She had seemed almost like a different person for those moments. Someone cold, distant, even mournful. He tried to dismiss it as the residue of his own fears, of everything they'd been through to reunite. But in the darkness, doubt crept under his skin. As he finally drifted off, one thought lingered. He had Claire back. Yes, but at what cost? And who exactly had he brought back into his life? Sunlight streamed golden through thinning clouds the next morning. Michael woke feeling almost normal, with Claire nestled against him. For a few blissful moments, he lay there listening to the soft hush of her breathing and birds chirping outside, forgetting the strange undercurrents of the night before. If there were any cracks in this reality, he was not yet ready to face them in the gentle light of day. They spent the early hours leisurely. Michael made pancakes from a mix he found in the pantry, and they ate on the porch, enjoying a rare break in the autumn chill as shafts of sunlight warmed the damp earth. Claire seemed cheerful again, laughing at his second attempt to flip a pancake that ended up half on the griddle's edge. If not for the lurking questions in Michael's mind, it could have been a perfect morning. He kept replaying her words from the window. "I keep thinking I hear something in the woods," and the faraway look in her eyes. But now she looked content, swinging her legs slightly as she sat on the porch railing, nibbling syrupy pancake pieces from her fingers. After breakfast, Michael mustered the courage to breach a delicate subject. "Claire," he began slowly, pouring them both another cup of coffee, Maybe we should think about heading back to town. Or at least letting someone know." He didn't even get to finish the thought. Claire's smile vanished instantly, her posture stiffening. "No," she cut in, voice sharp enough that it startled him. She slid off the railing to face him, eyes suddenly bright and hard. Why would we do that? Michael was taken aback by her sudden change in tone. I just meant your parents, our friends, everyone back home. They're still mourning you. They're devastated, Claire, if they knew you were alive. No, she snapped, and the force behind that single word made Michael flinch. The morning seemed to darken, a cloud passing over the sun. Claire set her coffee mug down so hard it sloshed. We can't tell anyone yet. They wouldn't understand. They'd... She trailed off, then pressed her lips together, struggling for composure. When she spoke again, her voice wavered. Michael, don't you see? This is our second chance. People will interfere. They might not accept this. Miracle. They might take me away for tests or think you're insane. We have to keep it to ourselves. At least for now. Her reasoning came out in a rush. Michael tried to catch her gaze, but she avoided his eyes, twisting her hands. She seemed genuinely distraught. His initial instinct was to comfort her, to say anything to erase that fear. He reached out, gently rubbing her arm. All right, he relented softly. We won't tell anyone, not until you're ready. Claire relaxed slightly, her shoulders losing some of their rigidity. She leaned into him, and he wrapped his arms around her. But as he held her, looking over her shoulder at the tranquil lake beyond, Michael couldn't shake a creeping unease. Claire's reaction had been so vehement, so unlike her easygoing nature, and the things she said, take me away, think you're insane, it was almost as if she was more concerned about him than herself. Or as if she suspected exactly how impossible her presence was. They spent the next few hours around the cabin. Claire suggested they attempt the jigsaw puzzle they'd left unfinished on a previous trip. Michael agreed, hoping a simple task might ease the lingering tension. They sat on the rug by the hearth, fitting pieces together. The normalcy of it calmed Michael's nerves some, enough that he ventured a question that had been haunting him. Do you remember anything? About what happened? He asked quietly. Claire paused, a puzzle piece in her hand. Her back stiffened almost imperceptibly. What do you mean? She replied, not looking up. The accident, Michael clarified, heart picking up pace. That night, I keep trying to recall details. I thought maybe you... I remember rain, Claire interrupted softly. She set the piece down and finally met his gaze. Her eyes were unreadable. Headlights and pain. Then nothing. Just darkness until I woke up and found my way back to you. Michael swallowed, throat dry. Woke up. Where? In the hospital. Claire looked away. I don't remember, she murmured. It's all hazy. I'm sorry. An uneasy quiet settled between them. Michael didn't press further. Perhaps she truly didn't remember, or perhaps recalling it was too traumatic. He understood that well enough. His own memories of that night were fragmented and dreamlike. Still, he felt a thread of frustration, an inexplicable itch that something was off-kilter. If she had simply woken up alive, why hadn't anyone seen? How had she gotten here? The practical questions nagged at him, but he didn't voice them. The fear of shattering their fragile peace was too great. That afternoon, while Claire stepped outside to gather some wildflowers by the driveway, Michael seized a moment alone. His phone lay on the kitchen counter where he'd left it after breakfast. With guilty caution, he plugged it into a charger and powered it on. Unsurprisingly, a flood of missed notifications popped up once it found a faint signal. Mostly old, but one text caught his eye, from his friend David. Hey Mike, checking in. Haven't heard from you in a week. Call me or I'll have to come up there myself. Michael's heart pinched with a mix of warmth and dread. He and David had been friends since college. David had been especially supportive after Claire's death. He no doubt meant well with that message, but the last thing Michael needed was a sudden visit, especially now with the impossible reality of Claire's return. How could he ever explain? And if he didn't, what would David think if he found Michael holed up alone talking to no one? Because who else would be able to see Claire? The thought hit Michael cold. Would anyone else even perceive her, or was she for him alone? Michael? Claire's voice, unexpectedly close, made him jump. He turned to see her standing in the doorway, a bunch of purple asters and goldenrod in her hand. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing slightly at the phone in his hand. What are you doing? He quickly locked the phone and gave a shaky smile. Just checking messages. I thought I should let people know I'm all right, so they don't worry. He hoped his tone was light, casual. her lips pressed into a thin line. We agreed, no reaching out yet. Michael raised his hands appeasingly. I wasn't calling anyone, I just looked. David texted, saying he might come up to visit if I don't respond. He's just worried. At that, Claire stepped inside, letting the screen door bang shut. The bouquet of wildflowers trembled in her grip. You told him about the cabin? Her voice was quiet, but there was an undercurrent in it that Michael didn't like. Something like fear or fury or both. Yes, before I left. He was concerned, so I told him where I'd be in case of an emergency, Michael admitted. He frowned, stepping toward her. Claire, why are you so upset? David doesn't even know you're here. If he came, we could just... No, she barked, startling him into silence. The flowers fell from her hand, scattering across the floorboards. Her expression twisted with anguish. I don't want anyone else here. It's supposed to be just us. Her voice cracked, and for the first time since she'd returned, Michael saw a flash of something raw and dark in her eyes, an agony that went beyond the simple plea she uttered. Please, I just got you back. I can't lose you again. Not to them. He was stung by her words. Lose me? Claire, you're not going to lose me. I'm right here. He moved closer, but she stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself. Her sudden shift dredged up his own fear. Unless I'm the one who's lost, he added haltingly. I keep thinking, what if none of this is real? What if I'm hallucinating all of it? The confession tumbled out, years of buried anxiety lending it force. I've been so scared that I'm broken, that it made you up because I couldn't bear the guilt. Stop, Claire hissed, voice low and trembling. Don't say that. You're not broken, and I'm here. I'm real. She reached for him then, clutching his arms with surprising strength. Her nails dug in slightly. This is real, Michael. Do you hear me? He nodded, startled by the intensity in her tone. Okay, I'm sorry. Claire's grip loosened, and she suddenly seemed to crumple, leaning into him. Michael held her reflexively. She was shaking. I'm sorry, too. She whispered against his chest. I just want to keep what we have. I want us to stay together, away from everything that tried to tear us apart. He stroked her hair, confusion and concern mingling in equal measure. We will, I promise. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere, okay? As he murmured soothing words, he noticed over her shoulder a dark bluish smudge on the side of her forehead, partially hidden by her hair. He gently drew back. You're hurt, he said, reaching to touch near the bruise. How did this happen? It looked like an old contusion, the kind one might get from hitting the dash or window in a car crash. He was certain it hadn't been there before. Claire lifted a hand to her temple and winced slightly as her fingers found the tender spot. For a moment she looked confused, even alarmed. Then her face smoothed over. I don't know. It doesn't matter. She tried to tuck her hair to hide the mark, but Michael gently caught her wrist. It does matter. That's from... He didn't finish the sentence. It looked exactly like an injury from the accident, but if she was here alive and healed, why would a bruise remain? Unless... No, he wouldn't go there. He swallowed hard. Maybe you bumped it yesterday and didn't realize, he offered weakly, trying to convince himself more than her. She gave a tight shrug, her eyes skittering away. Sure, that must be it. By late afternoon, Claire grew quiet and retreated to the bedroom, claiming she was tired. Michael cleaned up the scattered puzzle pieces and the wilted wildflowers from the floor. His mind churned. The bruise on her temple kept drawing his thoughts like a dark magnet, as did the desperation in her voice when she'd pleaded to keep him to herself. He felt a mounting anxiety that he couldn't quite name, a sense that something was terribly wrong beneath the surface of this miracle. Needing air, he decided to step out. The sun was dipping toward the trees, an orange glow washing over the clearing. Michael's gaze fell on his car parked a short distance away, partially hidden by pine boughs. He had barely paid attention to it since arriving, walking everywhere on the property and avoiding even looking at the vehicle unless necessary. Now, drawn by a grim curiosity, he approached it. It was a black SUV, its front end bearing the marks of repair. A new hood, a slightly misaligned left fender, fresh paint that was a shade glossier than the older panels. Seeing it up close made his stomach turn. The last time he'd driven this car had been the night of the accident. The mechanics had fixed it afterward, but in his mind he still saw it as a crumpled heap of metal and shattered glass. Michael ran a hand over the hood, which was cool and smooth. His fingers trembled as he reached the driver's side door and opened it. The interior still had faint traces of the chemical cleaner they used to wipe away the blood. He swallowed, heart pounding in his throat as he climbed into the driver's seat. The last time he'd sat here, Claire had been beside him, rain hammering the windshield. And they'd been arguing. Pieces of that night started to assemble in his mind like shards of the very puzzle they'd been piecing together. He gripped the steering wheel and closed his eyes. In his mind's eye, the memory unfurled. Rain on the windshield, heavy and relentless. Night blurred by water and tears of fury. "Michael, slow down." Claire's voice over the thrum of the wipers, high with alarm. But his foot was pressed hard on the accelerator. He remembered his knuckles white on the steering wheel, the headlights carving tunnels through the storm. They had been shouting moments before, her voice pleading, his voice raw and unhinged. "Please, pull over. Let's talk," Claire had said, trying to keep calm, though he could hear she was terrified. "Talk? Now you want to talk?" he had snarled. "After months of lying to me?" The accusation still burned, even now. What had he thought she lied about? In the moment he couldn't recall clearly. Something irrational. Yes, he had it now. He believed she was planning to leave him, that she'd conspired with his doctor to commit him to a psychiatric ward. It sounded insane in the light of day, but that night he'd been utterly convinced. Claire had been crying, saying, "I would never leave you. I was trying to help you." But he hadn't listened. The delusion was too strong. He remembered shouting back, "Liar!" Remembered the wild glance he had thrown her, seeing fear and heartbreak on her face and feeling some twisted vindication from it. The guilt of that realization stabbed him now. On the narrow forest road, something loomed ahead, a fallen branch, or perhaps he imagined it. He yanked the wheel without thinking. The SUV skidded. Tires screeched on slick asphalt. Claire screamed his name, "Michael!" A flash of pure terror and regret sliced through his rage at that instant, but it was too late. The car fishtailed and hurtled off the road. There was a sickening jolt as they hit an embankment, the world flipping, weightless. Glass exploded, metal crumpled like paper. He heard Claire's bones break. The sound would haunt him in nightmares to come. Her scream cut off with a violent choke. And then silence, except for the rain. Michael had hung upside down, held by his seatbelt, disoriented but alive. Pain throbbed through his shoulder and head, but he'd clawed his way free, crying out Claire's name into the wreckage. He could still feel the moment his shaking hands touched her face, slick with blood in the dark. Her body was twisted in the passenger seat, pinned. She wasn't moving. No, no, no. He had screamed, sobbed her name, begging her to wake up. In the torrent and the darkness, he cradled her broken body until headlights from another car found them, until strangers pulled him away from her. The memory ended with the echo of his own screams. Michael gasped, snapping back to the present inside the SUV. His face was wet with tears. He had remembered it all now. The irrational anger, the intentional speed, and the moment of fatal misjudgment. It wasn't a random accident or black ice. It was him. He had effectively killed Claire with his madness. A keening sound built in his throat, the agony of that truth too much to bear. Through his tears, Michael became aware of a presence beside him. His heart lurched. In the passenger seat sat Claire, just as he remembered in that final glimpse, her hair matted with blood, face pale, a gash across her brow and her neck at an odd angle. Her shirt was soaked dark with blood at the abdomen where a shard of metal protruded. This was not the Claire who had walked and talked with him these past days. This was Claire as she had been moments after the crash. Dead. Michael screamed hoarsely, scrambling back against the driver's door. His hand fumbled for the latch, and he half fell out of the car onto the ground. He scrambled away on all fours, panic flooding his veins. But the bloody figure of Claire simply vanished from the seat, only to reappear standing just a few feet from him. She stood in the amber light of dusk, a broken apparition. Her head lolled slightly to one side, and her eyes, those once warm brown eyes, were milky and vacant. Blood trickled from a corner of her mouth as she spoke. "You remember now, don't you?" The voice was Claire's, yet layered with a hollow resonance, as if echoing from a great depth. Michael's mouth worked, but no sound came. He could only stare in abject horror, shaking his head. The spectre took a step toward him, limbs moving jerkily. It wasn't the ice. It wasn't fate. Her voice grew bitter, distorted. You killed me, Michael. No, he croaked, throat raw. I didn't mean. I was sick. She let out a ghastly sound, half sob, half a wet, choking laugh. Sick. Is that what you tell yourself? That you lost control? Her eyes flashed suddenly, pupils burning black through the milky glaze. I saw your face, Michael. In that moment, you wanted to hurt me. Michael clamped his hands over his ears, as if he could shut out her words. He bent forward, retching on the ground. I'm sorry, he gagged. I'm so sorry. His mind felt like it was splintering. I loved you. I love you. I never wanted. Love? She hissed, suddenly right in front of him, her face contorted with fury and sorrow. You killed me, she shrieked, and the woods seemed to tremble with the force of her cry. Birds startled from treetops in a cacophony of wings. You took everything from me, our future, our baby. Her voice broke on a wail. Baby? Michael gasped, raising his head. Fresh agony lanced through him. They had been trying, but had she been carrying when she died? He would never know. The possibility alone made him want to claw his heart out. Claire, I'm sorry. Please. He reached out to her, palms up in supplication, tears pouring down his face. The apparition flickered. For a moment she seemed to soften, the ghastly injuries receding to faint impressions. Her eyes looked more like themselves, filled with profound grief. Why, Michael? She asked quietly, and it was just Claire's voice, his Claire, laden with heartbreak. How could you do this to me, to us? Michael crawled forward, collapsing at her feet. He couldn't stop sobbing. I was lost. I was sick. I wasn't me. I didn't know what I was doing, Claire. I swear. He dared to lift his arms as if to embrace her legs, begging forgiveness. I'd do anything to take it back. Anything. Please. She looked down at him, head tilted. One bloodied hand reached out and stroked his hair almost tenderly. Michael shuddered under the touch. Anything, she repeated, the hint of a sad smile on her lips. You'd do anything to be forgiven? Yes, he whispered brokenly. Anything. Tell me what to do. The apparition knelt, becoming level with him. Her face hovered inches from his. Despite the gore, he found himself longing to kiss her, to somehow undo all of this by love alone. But she spoke softly, each word cutting him deeper. If you truly love me, then come with me, Michael. His breath faltered. Come with you? He knew what she meant. Some part of him knew, and yet he asked, voice small. Her hand, sticky with half-dried blood, caressed his cheek. It's the only way for us to be together now, she whispered. You can't live with what you've done. You shouldn't. All that's left for you in life is pain. But if you come, maybe we can both find peace. Her eyes gleamed with a fervent, desperate light. Michael wasn't sure how long he knelt there on the forest floor, sobbing into the darkness. When he finally lifted his head, the apparition of Claire was gone. Only the quiet trees and the looming bulk of the cabin in the near distance kept him company. He staggered to his feet, every part of him aching, body and soul. His mind buzzed with horror and the echo of her demand, come with me. He stumbled toward the lake, drawn by some instinct or command beyond reason. The lake had always been a place of reflection and calm, but now its darkness held a new allure. Perhaps in those depths he would find her, or find the oblivion he deserved. The moon had risen, casting a pale glow on the rippling water, and between the whispering pines it beckoned him like a mirror to another world. At the shoreline he paused. The cold water lapped at his boots as if in greeting. Michael stared at his wavering reflection under the moonlight. He saw a man haunted and hollow, face streaked with dirt and tears. Somewhere behind that reflection he thought he saw movement, a second shape. He looked up and there she was, standing on the dock a few yards to his right. Claire, not the broken spectre from minutes ago, but the Claire he knew. Whole, beautiful, bathed in silver light. She regarded him with a sorrow so deep it made his breath catch. Her hair stirred in the breeze off the water. Michael felt himself drawn toward her. She extended a hand. Come, she whispered. It was the same word, but this time it was an invitation laced with tenderness. Michael's heart pounded. There was an aching temptation to just let go, to slip under the water and end all of this pain, to take her hand and trust that somehow, impossibly, they could be together. He stepped onto the dock, the wood wet and slick beneath him. Claire backed away slowly, leading him further out over the lake. Her eyes never left his. He was halfway down the dock when another voice cut through the night, soft pleading coming from behind him. "Michael, wait!" He froze. That was Claire's voice too, but gentler, urgent, impossible. He whirled around. Standing on the shore at the very spot he'd just left was Claire. She wore the flannel shirt and jeans from earlier, her form solid, her expression stricken with fear. She reached out a hand toward him. "Don't go," she cried softly. "Please, come back." Michael's head swiveled between the two Claires, one on the dock beckoning him forward, one on the shore begging him back. His mind reeled at the duplication. "Claire?" he whispered, desperate and confused. The Claire on the dock smiled sadly, hands still outstretched. The Claire on shore took a tentative step into the water, as if willing to wade out to him. "Michael, listen to me," the shore Claire called. "You don't have to do this. It wasn't your fault. I forgive you, you hear me? I forgive you." Her voice broke on a sob. He felt his heart tearing in two. The Claire on the dock, the one he had followed this far, shook her head. Her eyes glistened. "She's lying," this Claire said, voice soft but carrying over the water. "We both know whose fault it was. You haven't forgiven yourself. You never will. Come with me, Michael. It's the only way." There was a chill undertone to those words, even though her face remained loving. "No!" the Claire by the shore cried out. "Michael, if you trust me, if you ever loved me, don't go. Live, please, live." Tears streamed down her face. "I want you to be happy. I never wanted anything but your happiness, even if I couldn't be there. My sweetest love, living is the only way you can make this right." Michael swayed where he stood. This had to be madness. His shattered mind playing out an impossible tableau of guilt and longing. Two Claires each pulling at a piece of his soul. He didn't know what was real anymore. Who was real? The one on the dock felt like despair given form, a promise of escape that was as seductive as it was terrifying. The one on the shore glowed with the compassion and warmth that he remembered of his wife at her best, but he feared it was just his own conscience speaking. He took a step back toward shore, torn by the raw emotion in the second, Claire's voice. Seeing this, the dock Claire's expression darkened, something like fury or pain. "Don't you want to be with me?" she asked, and now there was an edge of desperation. She took a few steps closer. She was near enough that he could see tears in her eyes too. "Michael, please, I don't want to be alone in the dark anymore. I need you." He remembered the nights after the funeral, when he'd lay on their empty bed wishing he had died in her place, begging whatever gods might be listening to bring her back. Now here she was, in two forms, and he was paralyzed by indecision. "I don't know what's real," he choked out. His voice echoed over the water. "I don't know what to do." Doc Claire held his gaze. "Trust your love," she said simply, and for a moment her face flickered, not with malice but with sorrow so profound it was like looking into an abyss. Sure Claire said nothing, only extended her hand further, silently pleading. Michael realized with a calm clarity amidst the chaos of his mind that whichever choice he made would break his heart. Either embrace the darkness with the woman who was his guilt and grief incarnate, or return to the shore and face a life without her, carrying the weight of what he'd done. The pain of that prospect was almost unendurable. Fresh sobs racked his body. I can't do it," he moaned. "Claire, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." He wasn't even sure which version he was speaking to anymore. Maybe both. He took another step backward, his heel nearing the edge of the dock. The black water lapped hungrily just behind him. The Claire on the dock took this as a sign and moved closer, reaching for him eagerly, a smile of relief breaking over her face. "That's it, love. It'll all be over soon. We'll be together." But Michael's eyes were fixed on the Claire at the shore, who had now waded up to her knees in the icy water. She looked at him with such love and anguish that it cut through some of the fog in his mind. In that moment, she looked undeniably real, and he realized this was how Claire would truly feel if she were here. She would never ask him to die. She would beg him to live, just as she was doing now. That fundamental truth of who she was shone through the confusion. His next breath came easier, resolve hardening. Michael turned away from the phantom on the dock and lunged toward the shore. The dock was narrow. His sudden movement made it tilt and his foot slipped on the wet wood. He fell hard onto his side, a lance of pain shooting through his hip and ribs. The impact rattled the dock, and the Claire standing above him let out a snarl of frustration, bending down to grip his arm. Her fingers were ice and iron, and panic flared as he realized she was trying to drag him into the water. "No! Let me go!" Michael yelled, twisting. He could feel the unnatural strength in that grip, pulling him inch by inch toward the edge. The water splashed up, soaking his back and legs. Over his shoulder he saw the face of Doc Claire looming, no longer so perfectly composed. Her eyes were pits of darkness, her mouth contorted in an almost feral grimace. The beautiful facade was crumbling, revealing something hungry and enraged beneath. It was a visage of hatred and hurt, and it chilled him deeper than the lake water. From the shore, Claire screamed, "Fight it, Michael! Fight!" He kicked out wildly with his free leg, his boot connecting with the dock Claire's knee. She let out a shriek, not of pain, but of raw fury, and for a split second her hold loosened. Michael yanked his arm free and scrambled on all fours along the dock, trying to put distance between himself and that thing wearing Claire's face. A hand seized the back of his shirt, yanking him backward with inhuman force. He slid back, nails scrabbling on wet wood. The edge of the dock bit into his shoulder blades. Over him loomed the ghostly Claire, her form flickering between the woman he loved and a waterlogged corpse. "You're not leaving me again," she hissed. With a surge of strength, she shoved him off the dock. Michael hit the lake with a cold shock that knocked the breath from his lungs. The world became bubbles and muffled echoes as he sank a few feet into darkness. The chill was stunning, and instinct made him kick to surface, but something closed around his ankle, tugging him deeper. His head broke the surface for one desperate gasp of air, and he heard shouting, his name in Claire's voice. Then he was pulled under again. Underwater, moonlight filtered dimly. Michael's arms flailed, panic overwhelming all thought. He could see her, a pale figure under the water with him, eyes open and luminescent in the dark, hair billowing like black seaweed. Claire, or what remained of her, embraced him in a deathly grip, arms locking around his chest. His lungs burned. He tried to pry her off, but his strength was no match. As spots began dancing in his vision, Michael felt a strange calm within the terror. The face before him was Claire's once more, not monstrous but peaceful, even as her grip kept him under. Her hair floated around them, entangling him. She leaned forward and pressed her cold lips to his in a ghastly imitation of a kiss. In that frigid silence, he felt his heart shattering and surrendering all at once. Maybe this was how it was meant to end. Maybe he deserved no less. His limbs grew heavy. The urge to breathe was a riptide he could no longer fight. Michael parted his lips against hers, and the lake rushed in. Cold, dark water filled his mouth, his throat, his lungs. He jerked and convulsed, eyes wide in blind panic. The figure holding him stroked his hair gently, almost lovingly, as everything started to go black. Just as consciousness slipped, he thought he saw another shape diving into the water, a third form, a surge of motion, and hands grasped his coat, pulling. His body was yanked upward, away from the embracing ghost. He broke the surface, and sweet air flooded back into his burning lungs as he vomited water and wheezed. The night reeled around him in chaos. He felt himself dragged, coughing and choking, onto the pebbled shallows of the shore. Gasping, half-blind with lake water and tears, Michael felt strong arms around him, turning him on his side. He coughed violently, ejecting more water, and sucked in ragged breaths. Above the roar in his ears, he heard urgent, panicked words. "Michael! Oh God, Michael! Breathe, just breathe." It was Claire's voice. He blinked water from his eyes and saw her kneeling over him in the shallows, the Claire from the shore, drenched and pale, her teeth chattering. She was alive and solid, holding him close. She had saved him. On the lake, the water heaved. A furious scream echoed across the surface, inhuman and despairing. Both Michael and Claire turned their heads in time to see a figure thrashing in the centre of the lake, too far to make out clearly, but he knew it was her, the other her, the thing that had lured him out. It writhed and howled, the sound like a hurricane of grief, then with a final splash, it vanished beneath the black water. Michael clung to the woman beside him, shaking uncontrollably from cold and shock. She wrapped her arms around him, and he felt her solid warmth, heard her heart hammering against his ear where he pressed against her chest. "I've got you," she whispered over and over, rocking him as he sobbed into her shoulder. "You're okay. I've got you." Michael closed his eyes, clinging to the sound of her heartbeat. It felt real, and for now that was enough. "Claire," he whispered. Whether he was addressing the woman holding him or the one who had vanished in the lake, even he wasn't sure. "I'm so sorry." She shushed him gently. "I know," she murmured. "I forgave you long ago, my love." Her words were a balm, easing some of the crushing weight inside him. He wanted to ask her if she was real, if she would stay, but exhaustion was pulling him under. He let himself relax for the first time in half a year, in what felt like a lifetime. The last thing he felt was a soft kiss on his forehead, and her voice, faint and tender. "Live, Michael, that's all I ever wanted for you." He drifted into darkness, whether sleep or unconsciousness he did not know, the taste of lake water on his lips and the scent of vanilla and jasmine enveloping him. The sun crested the horizon, painting the morning sky in bands of pink and gold, when David Pierce's pickup truck rumbled down the final gravel stretch toward Michael's cabin. He had been tense the whole drive up, worried sick after days of no contact. As the cabin came into view between the trees, he let out a sigh of relief at the sight of smoke gently wisping from the chimney. Michael must have lit a fire at some point. At least the place wasn't deserted. David parked and stepped out, stretching his stiff limbs. "Michael," he called, the quiet of dawn carrying his voice. No response. The forest was eerily silent, but for the lap of lake water and the distant call of a mourning dove. David's brow furrowed. He walked up the porch steps and noticed the front door slightly ajar. An uneasy feeling coiled in his stomach. Pushing the door fully open, he stepped inside. "Mike, it's Dave!" he shouted into the cabin. The interior was dim and smelled of cold ashes and something else, a sweet note like vanilla that seemed out of place. David scanned the room. The fireplace was out, just charred logs and ash. A single mug sat on the kitchen table next to an overturned chair, coffee cold and untouched. Anxiety mounting, David quickly searched each room. The bed was unmade, sheets damp. Michael's phone lay on the bedside table, still plugged into a charger. But no sign of Michael. Heart pounding, David hurried outside toward the lake, following instinct. As he jogged around the side of the cabin, his foot kicked something in the grass. He stopped and picked it up. A gold heart-shaped locket on a broken chain, glinting in the early light. He recognized it. He'd seen Claire wear it at gatherings. How the hell did it get here? He pocketed the necklace and pressed on, dread growing with each step. Near the shore he came upon them, muddy footprints and drag marks, as if someone had been pulled from the water. "Michael!" David called again, voice tight. Then he saw a form lying motionless at the water's edge, half on the pebbled bank, half in the shallows. "Oh, God!" He sprinted over and dropped to his knees beside his friend. Michael lay on his side, eyes closed, clothes soaked, lips blue with cold. For one horrified second, David thought he was too late, that Michael was dead. But then a faint shuddering breath escaped Michael's lips, and his eyelids fluttered. Relief crashed over David. "Mike!" he gasped, gently turning him onto his back. "Jesus, you're freezing!" Michael's eyes opened a crack. They were bloodshot, unfocused. He blinked up at David in confusion. David?" he rasped, barely audible. "It's me, buddy. I've got you." David shrugged off his jacket and draped it over Michael. "Hang on, I'm going to get you warm. What happened?" He glanced around, half expecting to see someone else. Who, he didn't know. Michael's gaze drifted past David to the lake behind him. A strange, wistful smile touched his cracked lips. "She saved me," he whispered. David frowned. "Who? There's no one here, Mike." He followed Michael's eyes to the empty lake and shoreline, perplexed. The morning mist curled over the water's surface, serene and undisturbed. Michael coughed weakly, and David helped him sit up. He had to prioritize. Michael was clearly hypothermic and injured. Questions could come later. "Let's get you inside," David said, heaving Michael's arm over his shoulders. Michael was shivering violently now, his teeth chattering. He looked around dazedly, as if searching for someone. As David half carried him back toward the cabin, Michael mumbled something between chattering teeth. It sounded like Claire. David's grip tightened protectively. "I know, Mike," he murmured. "I miss her too." He assumed his friend was delirious, stuck in some half-dream. Inside, David settled Michael by the cold fireplace and quickly set about rekindling a fire from the leftover wood. He wrapped Michael in 2 blankets from the couch and rubbed his arms to generate heat. Gradually, some colour returned to Michael's face. He sat in a stunned silence, eyes on the flames. David recognised shock when he saw it. He wanted to ask 100 questions, but he held back, letting Michael come around on his own. Instead, he poured a bit of whiskey from a flask he carried and urged Michael to sip. Minutes passed in silence except for the snap of new kindling catching fire. At length, Michael spoke, voice low and hoarse. "I saw her, Dave." David glanced at him. Michael wasn't looking at him, but at something just beyond the flames, eyes distant. "Claire," he clarified softly, "she was here." David's heart ached. Survivor's guilt, the therapist had said. Trauma. "Mike," he began gently, not sure how to respond, but Michael turned to him with surprising steadiness, a kind of calm in his expression that David hadn't seen in months. "Maybe I'm crazy," he said, "but she saved my life. She forgave me." His voice trembled on the last words and tears glinted in his eyes. I need you to know that." David swallowed hard. He gave a tentative nod. "Okay," he said quietly. If this was what Michael needed to believe to come through the other side of his grief, David would not argue. "Okay." Michael eased back against the couch, exhaustion lining his face. He closed his eyes, 2 tears slipping down his cheeks. "She's gone now," he whispered. I think she just needed me to remember and to let her go." David reached out and clasped his friend's shoulder, solid and reassuring. "You're not alone, Mike. I'm here. We'll get through this together." Michael opened his eyes and managed a grateful, if sad, smile. The firelight danced in his pupils. "Thank you," he said simply. He looked around the cabin at the painting easel in the corner, at the photograph on the mantel of brighter days. I think I'm ready to go home now." David squeezed his shoulder. "Then let's get you home." As the sun climbed higher, David helped Michael pack a few essentials. Michael moved like someone in a reverie, wincing at bruises, but carrying a lightness about him that David had not seen in a long time. Before leaving, Michael stepped out onto the porch for a final look at the tranquil lake. David gave him space, waiting by the truck. The morning was bright and calm, the horrors of the night hidden beneath the lake's mirror surface. Michael closed his eyes and drew a deep breath of the pine-laced air. In the quiet, he could almost imagine Claire beside him one last time. He felt an echo of her presence, a warmth at his side like a final goodbye. "I love you," he whispered to the stillness, voice steady. The wind carried a hint of jasmine to his nose, and he let out a shuddering breath that was not quite grief and not quite relief. Perhaps it was a bit of both. When he opened his eyes for just a heartbeat, Michael thought he saw a figure standing on the far shore across the lake, a woman in an old grey sweater, watching him. The sun was in his eyes. He blinked and the figure was gone. A trick of the light, he told himself, or something else. Either way, he felt no fear, only a poignant sorrow and a tender gratitude. "Goodbye, Claire," he murmured. Perhaps only the trees heard. Michael turned and walked to the truck where his friend waited, ready to take him back to the world of the living. Behind him, the lake lay silent and deep, keeping its secrets beneath the surface. In that silence, the truth of what happened would linger, somewhere between memory and reality, love and remorse. The sweetest thing, lost and found and lost again, echoing like a faint laugh across the water. Some love stories never die. They simply change shape, haunting the spaces where memory and guilt intertwine. Michael closed his eyes and drew a deep breath of the pine-laced air. In the quiet, he could almost imagine Claire beside him one last time. He felt an echo of her presence, a warmth at his side like a final goodbye. "I love you," he whispered to the stillness, voice steady. The wind carried a hint of jasmine to his nose, and he let out a shuddering breath that was not quite grief and not quite relief. Perhaps it was a bit of both. When he opened his eyes for just a heartbeat, Michael thought he saw a figure standing on the far shore across the lake, a woman in an old grey sweater, watching him. The sun was in his eyes. He blinked and the figure was gone. A trick of the light, he told himself, or something else. Either way, he felt no fear, only a poignant sorrow and a tender gratitude. "Goodbye, Claire," he murmured. Perhaps only the trees heard. Michael turned and walked to the truck where his friend waited, ready to take him back to the world of the living. Behind him, the lake lay silent and deep, keeping its secrets beneath the surface. In that silence, the truth of what happened would linger, somewhere between memory and reality, love and remorse. The sweetest thing, lost and found and lost again, echoing like a faint laugh across the water. Some love stories never die. They simply change shape, haunting the spaces where memory and guilt intertwine. Michael Rowe walked through fire and shadow to uncover the truth, only to find that the past doesn't vanish, it waits. And sometimes the sweetest thing isn't love itself, but the price you're willing to pay to let it go. Love doesn't fade, it follows.
Every story has an end, but here, the mysteries never stop. Thank you for watching and being a part of this journey into the unknown. Your support keeps these stories alive, and there's plenty more waiting for you. We drop 3 new stories every week, so if you crave suspense, the unexplained and the downright chilling, make sure you're subscribed and ready for what's next. Until then, keep your lights on, your doors locked, and remember, some stories stay with you long after they're told.